Hey everyone, time for another video. This month we will be talking about weeding, trellising, composting, and harvesting. So let's just dive right in. All right, managing weeds. Despite your best efforts to hoe all of your weeds on time, some probably will still get away from you. So beyond hoeing and mulching, there are other ways to keep your weeds under control and to prevent them in the first place. The most important thing to keep your weeds under control long term is to not let them go to seed. A single plant can produce thousands of seeds, so if they are released, they will be with you for years. Seeds always follow flowers, so if you have flowering weeds, make sure to focus on those right away to save yourself a lot of future hassle. If you do end up with weeds with seeds, sometimes they'll shatter and drop all of their seeds if you touch them. In that case, just try to keep them all contained. You can even throw a towel or something over the plant to keep them from flying across the garden. If you've pulled out the weeds going to seed and you still have too many to get all of them, you can prioritize based on your crops. Younger crops will always be the most affected by weeds compared to more established ones, so try to keep newly planted areas under control. Next, you have your shortest crops, onions, lettuce, carrots, and so on. They have the hardest time competing, and the weeds can outgrow them and shade them out, so that would be your next highest priority. A lower priority is vining crops like sweet potatoes and winter squash. The larger the vines grow, the harder it will be to get in and remove any weeds, but the vines usually do a pretty good job of competing. And then the lowest priority is tall crops that are already ahead of the weeds. If they're well above the height of the weeds, they're not competing, and the weeds can actually act as like a nice ground cover for them. So if you don't have the time or the energy to rip out every weed in this situation, you can just cut them off at or near the ground level to stop them from seeding and then just let them be. As long as your weeds aren't getting as tall as your crops or setting seeds, they actually benefit the soil. They act as a living mulch, increasing microorganism activity, acting as a habitat for predator insects that will kill your pests, and protecting the soil from compaction and erosion. So it's up to you how many weeds you keep and how many you remove at this like taller established plant level, just depending on your tolerance for having weeds in your garden. Soil will always have weed seeds in it. It's called your weed seed bank, and it can be very full of seeds or not very full. But every time you move the soil around, you will bring weed seeds up to the surface where they will germinate. You can use this to your advantage. Many farmers will intentionally irrigate their fields before they plant to get a weed flush and then easily get rid of them all at once. Hoeing your garden a few times will have the same effect. By getting the seeds at the surface of the soil to germinate and then killing them, you are reducing the number of seeds in your soil seed bank. But if you disturb the soil deeper down, it will bring new weed seeds to the surface. And this is another benefit of no-till gardening. One thing that is incredibly helpful for handling weeds is to know what they are. If you're familiar with the most common types of weeds that you have in your garden, then you'll know the best way to get rid of each one. It's usually not too hard to figure out what a weed is. Of course, you can ask me. You can also look online. You can just try describing it in Google or posting a photo and a description in a forum online. And there are also a number of plant ID apps out there that work pretty well. And then once you know what the weed is, you can read a little bit about it, find out whether it's an annual, which are usually much easier to kill, or a perennial, which might give you trouble. You can find out what methods other people are using to control it, and so on. Even if you don't know what the weed is called, you can learn a whole lot about it by paying attention to the way it grows. Notice what its roots look like, how tall it gets, what the seeds look like. All of that will help you figure out how to get rid of it. Root structure is usually the most important, particularly perennial weeds, because they will grow back if you leave part of the roots. A classic example is dandelions. These have a huge taproot which stores enough energy for the plant to keep growing back and back if you only pull off the top. So the whole thing has to be dug out. The best way to dig out deep tap roots is to pull very slowly from the base of the plant, even holding it a little underground if you can, and help pry it up with your trowel if you need to, like you would with a carrot, because if you yank it, it'll almost certainly snap off. So Bermuda grass and many other grasses have a long running rhizome or underground stem that runs along just under the surface of the soil. Just a 1-inch piece of this rhizome is enough to sprout a whole new plant, so be sure to get as much of that long rhizome as you can. Nutsedge is a plant that looks pretty similar to grass, but it has a bulb that breaks off and stays in the soil when you pull it up. So that's one to watch out for. Wild violets have a really knobby rhizome, that underground stem, which also stores a ton of energy, so be mindful of that. Thistles can really fool you. A lot of people think that thistles just have a deep taproot, so if they pull the thistle straight out, it'll be gone. But usually there's actually a long root that runs horizontally underground and connects multiple thistle sprouts. And this can be really deep down in the ground, so you have to look for it. Also, everyone says that it's easier to pull weeds when it's wet, and that's sort of true, especially if you have compressed soil. But in well-aerated soil, it's actually really easy to pull weeds when the soil is dry. What people should say is to pull weeds when the soil is moist, but not wet. They'll be a lot harder to pull out if it's muddy, and you'll end up pulling a lot of soil with the roots. So stay out of your garden when it's wet, like I've said before, and don't be tempted to go pull weeds right after it rains. Weeds can be a great source of green material for your compost, but you may want to put any weeds with seeds or with perennial roots into a separate pile that you use elsewhere, unless you're really confident that your pile gets plenty hot to kill them. Otherwise, you're just putting them right back into your garden. You will be needing trellises for a few of your crops, so let's talk about those for a bit. Trellises are just the structures in your garden that help hold plants upright. There are a whole lot of different shapes and materials for trellises, but their main purpose is just to hold your plants up above the ground. This year, those will be pole beans, cucumbers, melons, and tomatoes. Trellises are great for saving space with vining crops, and they keep them from spreading all across your garden. They also keep fruits off the ground, like a cucumber is much more likely to rot if it's sitting in a mud puddle. It makes harvest easier because you don't have to bend over, they're usually easier to find, and the increased airflow through the leaves means that there will be less of a chance of fungal diseases. Like I mentioned, the crops we'll be trellising this year are pole beans, cucumbers, melons, and tomatoes. You can also trellis winter squash and sweet potatoes, but you don't want to overdo it with trellises or your non-trellis plants won't stand a chance. There are other plants that sometimes do and sometimes don't need a trellis. Peas, for example, sometimes should be trellised, but we're using short varieties this year that should be able to stand up on their own. You can find lima beans that grow as a pole type or a bush type. This year we're growing a bush type. And there are also bush varieties of cucumbers if you'd like to try those in the future to save space. The type of trellis that you choose will depend on each crop. Pole beans will wind themselves around and upward as they grow, so they just need anything tall to help them climb. Cucumbers have tendrils to hold onto a trellis, so they need plenty to grab a hold of. And melons can grab on, but you will probably need to tie them onto the trellis in a few places to keep them in place. You'll also need a very strong, sturdy trellis to hold heavy melons up. Tomatoes don't grab at all, so they'll need specific support to keep them upright, and we'll talk about that in a bit. There's a million formats for trellises. I'll just run through the most common shapes. First, you can make a really basic trellis by just sticking some posts in a line and then stringing either some type of grid mesh across it or a series of strings. If it's meant to support a lot of weight, you might want to use something like T-posts and cattle panel, and for a lighter weight, you could use U-posts and a plastic mesh or twine. And zip ties work really well for attaching fencing to the posts. This kind of trellis is nice because you can build it to fit your space just right, and it's pretty easy to put together. And you can take it apart at the end of the season, you can leave it permanently, or you can lift it out and roll it up and save it for next year. One side note, it's a good idea to use a gridded mesh for cucumbers and melons so they can grab on easily, but make sure you use a wide enough mesh so that they don't get pinched. Then you have an A-frame. It's basically just two sides leaned up against each other, and you can even attach them with a hinge at the top so it can be folded away for next year. It can be made of pretty much anything. Most have a wooden frame, and then the lattice can be made of more wood, wire, twine, anything for your plants to grab onto. How open or closed you want the weave depends on what materials you have and what kind of vegetable you're growing. Then there's a teepee shape. You'll see this one a lot for pole beans. It's quick and easy to build. You just take 3 or more poles, bamboo, straight branches, whatever else you have around, and tie them together at the top. You can make a short one for something like peas or a really tall one for pole beans. They're a super flexible design, and if you want your vines to hold on even better, you can wrap twine around the entire structure to give them more to grab onto. And the same idea can be accomplished with a foldable, reusable box shape like this, or an obelisk, or any similar tower shape. And then there are natural trellises. Corn and sunflowers are usually what people use. Their tall pole shape can be a really great support for pole beans. They save space and effort, but you do have to time it right. Wait to plant your beans until the corn is 4 to 6 inches tall, or if sunflowers are at least 12 inches or taller so that the beans don't take over. There is a chance that the corn or the sunflower stalk could fall over before your beans are finished, so be prepared to stake them up if needed. This method is really fun, but if you want to grow more than a couple pole bean plants, I would recommend building a trellis that's just for them. So clearly a trellis is not something that you have to go out and buy. Like mulch, trellises are another thing where you can get lured into thinking that you need to go buy them from the store, but you can make them yourself pretty easily with materials you already have around, or can buy much more cheaply than a complete trellis. And if you build it yourself, you can get the exact size and shape that you want. One thing to note, a trellis covered with leaves does create shade, so try to place your trellises strategically. Having shade in your garden can be good if you want to grow something that prefers cool, moist conditions like lettuce during the hot summer, but the plants like peppers that love heat and sun won't get as much. So you have a choice. The sun moves east to west in the sky, and it's always slightly to the south. So if you run your trellis pointing north-south, the crops to the east and west will get less sunlight over the course of the day, but in a balanced amount, half and half. If you build it in the east-west direction, the plants to the north will get a significant amount of shade, and the ones south of the trellis won't get any shade. But really, this is only important towards the end of the summer, when the trellis is actually all the way covered with leaves. And if you're worried about creating too much shade, you can space a few trellises out around your garden instead of doing one big one. And it'll never be perfect, especially if you already have trees near your garden, and it's really not a huge deal, but it is just something to keep in mind when you plan your garden each year. All right, let's get into a few more specifics. For melons, your cantaloupe and watermelons, it's safer to plant these on the ground because there's no risk of them falling down and getting smashed, but growing them on a trellis does save a lot of space. Some of their vines can grow extremely long, 10 or 20 feet outward. So if you plant another variety in the future, make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into. This Sugar Baby variety of watermelon that we're growing this year is really great for a trellis because the vine is much shorter than most. So yeah, if next year you want to plant a longer vine or a variety with larger, heavier fruits, you may want to grow it on the ground, but you could plant it outside of your garden where it could take up more space and then just protect the fruits from hungry animals. Because even these small sugar baby melons can be about 10 pounds each. So to support that weight, you will need to make a sling to hold the melons up. You can do this for both cantaloupes and watermelons. Cantaloupes will actually fall off the vine when they're ripe, so it's extra important for them. And you can use any type of fabric. Stretchy nylon stockings work well, and you just support the fruit and tie the sling to the trellis. You can tie it in one place, like a bag, or in two places, like a hammock. Just make sure that you leave enough space for the melon to grow. And I would recommend putting it in the sling when the melon is about the size of a softball, and then check on it occasionally in case you need to readjust. Before we talk about how to trellis tomatoes, let's talk about the two different types of tomatoes. Bush tomatoes are also called determinate tomatoes. They grow to a certain size, like 3 to 5 feet, and then stop, and all of the fruit ripens together over the course of a few weeks, and then the plant is finished. These tomatoes are the best type for processing and canning. Vine tomatoes are also called indeterminate tomatoes, and they keep growing all season long. They'll be at least 6 feet tall, and they can grow 10 feet or more if you prune and train them. These tomatoes are ready one or two at a time, steadily over several months until it gets too cold. These are the best tomatoes for slicing and eating fresh. Since bush or determinate tomatoes don't grow as tall, it's not as important to trellis them as the vine or indeterminate tomatoes, but both kinds definitely benefit from a trellis. If you let them grow on the ground, they're much more vulnerable to disease, and you may find that a lot of your tomatoes rot before you can harvest them. So vine tomatoes aren't like climbing vines. They grow tall and spindly, but unlike pole beans or cucumbers, they don't have any tendrils or anything to grab onto a trellis. So that means they need to be well supported. Tomatoes are also heavy, and bush tomatoes in particular get very heavy all at once. So you want to make sure that you have something sturdy that supports them on all sides. So you have two main choices to make when trellising tomatoes. First is whether you support them individually or all together in a long trellis. I recommend doing them in a long trellis if you have more than maybe 4 or so plants, because it'll save you time overall, but supporting them individually if you only have a couple of plants, because it's not really worth the effort of setting up the trellis. The other is whether you give them horizontal support or vertical support. Horizontal support is like a tomato cage where the sides are keeping the plant from falling over. Vertical support is like a stake where you tie the tomato plant up to keep it moving upward. I recommend horizontal support for bush tomatoes because they don't need quite as much support, and vertical support for vine tomatoes because they grow so much taller. So I recommend using cages if you have a few bush plants, a horizontal trellis if you have a lot of bush plants, stakes if you have a few vine plants, and a vertical trellis if you have a lot of vine plants. And of course you can branch out and try other things if you want. Let's talk about tomato cages. This is the type that you see at the store, or there are also some sturdier models out there, and it does work. I definitely wouldn't recommend it for indeterminate tomatoes because a 4-foot cage is not going to be able to support an 8 or 10-foot vine. When you use a tomato cage, it can sometimes get overcrowded in the center and shade itself too much, not to mention making it harder for you to get in there and pick fruit or spray fungicide or find any tomato hornworms. So you may need to prune some of the leaves out of the middle. You also might need to direct the branches upward in case they get stopped and pushed down by the wires, but otherwise this is a pretty low maintenance option for your bush tomatoes. A tall stake is a good option for your indeterminate tomatoes if you can get a stake that's at least 6 or 8 feet tall. You drive it into the ground next to your plant and then periodically tie the plant to the stake to keep it upright. When you do this, tie them gently. The stems can be scratched by twine, so some people choose fabric scraps or flagging tape instead, and just tie it loosely so that there is room for the vine to move and grow. This figure 8 shape works well, and this is also a good method for tying melon vines onto their trellis. A horizontal trellis is best for managing a lot of bush tomatoes, and it's a version of that basic post and twine trellis I talked about earlier. You have to use posts that have some thickness to them because you will be tying strings on both sides of the posts and the plants to keep them from falling over. T-posts work well for this. The post can be set as closely as every other plant if you want, or as wide as every 4 or 5 plants. And then you tie the strings so they're on the outside of the posts, leaving a gap in between for the vines to grow through. And you continue adding lines of string as the plants grow around every 8 to 12 inches. And I don't recommend doing all of the strings in advance because then it's a lot harder to corral everything into place. Make sure that the string is very tight so that it can hold the weight of the really heavy plant with all of its tomatoes, and tie each section off separately so that if one piece breaks, it doesn't all come tumbling down. You can also use this method for indeterminate tomatoes if you want, as long as you use tall enough T-posts. In a vertical trellis, you would prune each plant to one straight vine, but on a horizontal trellis like this, you can keep 3 main branches for an indeterminate tomato. So using this method saves some work compared to the vertical trellis if you want to be more hands-off. The vertical trellis is the most high maintenance, but I do recommend it if you find yourself having pest or disease issues because it makes everything easier to see and it gives the best airflow. Instead of using stakes, you hang strings down from an overhead support and then clip the vines onto that. So you can accomplish this by adding a strong top bar over T-posts or any other posts set between the plants, and hanging strings down from there. Or you could also use a trellis like in the shape of a swing set. And then you can clip the tomatoes onto the string like this to hold them up as they grow. With these clips, you pinch the string with the back part to keep it from sliding, and then you close the loop around the stem. When you use this method, you prune the plants to a single vine with no branches. And like I said, this is more work, but if you want to focus on your indeterminate tomatoes, this can be a rewarding option. So what do I mean when I talk about pruning tomatoes? This is cutting out some or all of their branches to help them focus their growth on their fruit production and to fit your trellis. So determinate bush tomatoes don't need to be pruned. You can take off a branch or two if you need to direct their growth or keep them off the ground, but as long as they're doing okay, you should leave bush tomatoes alone. That is after you've removed any leaves that are within a couple inches of the ground. There are a couple ways to prune indeterminate vine tomatoes. If you're doing the vertical trellis, you want to grow it as a single vine with no branches. And if you're growing it along the horizontal trellis, like I mentioned, where it can get a little bushier while still being supported, you can focus on having 3 main branches. To stop any other branches from growing, you remove what's called the suckers. The suckers are actually just baby branches, and they grow in the elbows between the leaves and the main stem. The younger you pull them off, the less damage it will do to the plant. So look for these suckers at least weekly or anytime you're working on your tomatoes. You want to be able to just pinch the sucker away because if you have to cut the branch off, that's a bigger injury for the tomato to heal from. And they do sometimes start to grow back, so when you're pruning, make sure that you check back down lower on the plant where you've already pruned, because if you miss a sucker and it becomes a fully formed branch, it's much harder to notice. All right, composting. I've probably talked enough already about how magical and amazing compost is, so let's just dive into how to do it. First, I'll say that you can buy compost by the truckload, and this is a really good resource because you may not be able to make as much as you'd like to use. City of Bristol and Wolf Farm Natural Elements in Abingdon both have good compost available. You can also buy it by the bag, and this is fine if you just need a little to supplement. but if you're buying more than a couple bags, consider other options because it's not worth the cost. You can also buy worm castings. It's just a giant bag of worm poop, but it's packed with organic matter and nutrients much stronger than compost. It's more expensive than compost too if you buy it, but you can actually start a little worm farm at home and make your own castings if you want to. This is called vermiculture or vermicomposting. It's essentially just a big box of worms that you feed your food scraps to. It's a really cool project if you're interested. It's kind of like having a new pet, and you get ultra concentrated compost out of it. So to make compost, essentially you just make a pile of materials that you want to decompose. Food scraps, weeds, lawn clippings, fallen leaves, whatever you have around. You'll try to balance the ratio of green materials and brown materials to get the pile to decompose nicely, and you should turn or mix the compost every so often so that it will break down evenly. It's hard to say exactly how long it will take for the pile to decompose entirely and be ready for you to spread it in your garden. Depending on what's in the pile and how it's managed, it could be anywhere from 2 months to a year. So what are greens and what are browns? These are the two categories of materials you use to make compost. In many cases, it actually is more or less the color of the material, but not always. Green materials are just fresher materials. They usually have a lot more moisture in them, and they are going to rot. Things like food scraps, crop residue, freshly cut grass, and these green materials are filled with nitrogen. Browns are more stable, more dry. They have less activity over time, so like sawdust, straw, dry leaves, and browns are filled with carbon. If you left out a pile of sawdust for a week versus a pile of banana peels, there would be a whole lot more going on with the pile of banana peels. So having a balance of your greens and your browns, your nitrogen sources and your carbon sources, will help your pile decompose gradually, not too fast or too slow. A lot of people try composting and they find it to be stinky and slimy and a huge mess, and they never do it again. But that is not how composting is supposed to go. If your pile stinks, that is not normal. That is a sign of too much nitrogen or the green materials. There's a lot of debate on what exactly the ratio of the two materials should be for the ideal balance. And really, it's not an exact science. Every material is different, so you can start with half greens and half browns and then just observe your pile and make adjustments. If the pile is really smelly and gross, there's probably too many greens, and if it isn't decomposing much at all, you probably need more greens. You should be fine if your ratio is 1:1, 2:1, or 3:1, depending on your priorities. If you're aiming for a really hot pile with a quick turnover, you'll want more nitrogen, but if your goal is to keep any possible pests away and you don't mind if it's slow, you might want more carbon. The other major cause of a smelly compost pile is not enough oxygen. The microorganisms breaking down the materials in compost need plenty of oxygen to live. When a pile has plenty of air in it, it's called aerobic. If there is not enough oxygen in the pile, it becomes anaerobic, no air. This is bad news because the microorganisms begin to die and the pile begins to smell. Most often this happens when the pile gets too wet. If you suspect your pile has gone anaerobic, turn it as soon as possible to bring more air into the middle and the bottom. And if the pile is too wet, you can also add some dry browns for bulk. You can keep your pile from getting too wet by just throwing a tarp over it, either all the time or just before any heavy rains. To start a compost pile, choose a spot that's out of the way where the compost can sit permanently or at least for several months at a time. Begin with a few shovelfuls of your garden soil on the ground. This will help inoculate your pile with helpful microorganisms. Also, every time you empty out your pile, leave an inch or two of compost at the bottom to help inoculate your next batch and get it going faster. Then you add a layer of bulky browns at the bottom, something that will help with soil aeration. And make sure that you add several bulky layers throughout your pile to make sure that there's enough oxygen even deep in the middle of the pile to keep it from going anaerobic. Then you layer a few inches of greens, then a few inches of browns, and so on, ending with browns on top. There are a ton of different styles of compost bins out there. You don't actually need one at all, and I find that they kind of get in the way, but you certainly can use a bin if you'd rather keep everything a bit tidier. The most common is a cube shape with 3 walls and 1 open side for access, sometimes with a few lined up for multiple piles. And there are much fancier systems that you can buy, but don't be fooled into thinking that you need to buy a composter. You can start your pile right on the ground, or you can build a bin yourself pretty easily out of wood or wire. The more often you turn or mix your pile, the faster it will be finished. The minimum is to turn your pile once just to make sure everything gets incorporated evenly, but you can turn it every week if you want to. Every 3 weeks is usually a good amount if you want to keep it going pretty quickly. It's enough to just use your fork to pick up the pile and move it into the space next to where it was, and then you can move it back for a more complete stir, or you can do that another day. If you find that turning the pile is difficult for you, you can use a compost aerator instead. It's a stick that you plunge into the pile, and then it opens up on the way back out, and it pulls the material up and stirs it. The other option that's much easier on your back is to get a compost tumbler. This is a big bin that you rotate to stir your compost. They're a few $100, but if turning the pile by hand really isn't an option for you and you're interested in it, it could be a worthwhile investment. And make sure that if you use a compost tumbler, it should have at least 2 compartments so that you can be adding materials to one side while you wait for the other side to finish. But the free option that uses minimal effort is to just do what's called passive composting, where you don't turn your pile much or at all. The less you turn your pile, the longer it will take to finish, but it will all decompose eventually. So what is passive composting? There are 2 different ways you can compost. If you want your pile to heat up and then be finished quickly, you should use hot or batch composting. For this, you need to save up materials for a while and then put them together into a big pile all at once. If you'd rather add materials as you have them instead of saving them up, you could do cold or passive composting. You add materials whenever you have them, but this will not get hot enough to kill weed seeds, and it will take quite a bit longer to finish. You can also do some of each. You can do a passive pile, maybe in the spring when you aren't producing tons of waste, but maybe in the fall when you have a lot of leaves and crop residue, you might want to do a big hot pile all at once. Hot piles do get very hot. Don't be surprised if you turn your pile and see steam rising up out of it. For compost to be certified, it must reach a temperature of at least 131 degrees Fahrenheit and hold that temperature for 15 days. This makes sure that any diseases in the compost, any weed seeds are killed. You do not have to reach this temperature for your home compost to be usable. But if you are worried about any contamination, you may want to aim for that temperature. If your pile reaches above 150 degrees, the microorganisms helping to decompose the pile begin to die off. And if your pile is getting too hot, turning it will help cool it down. When you do batch composting, save everything up until you have enough to make a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot pile. It needs to be this big to hold in enough heat. However, you shouldn't go larger than a 5 foot cube because then it may be too hard for oxygen to reach the center of the pile. But if you want to do a long pile, you could do 5 foot by 5 foot and then in the other direction go longer to make sure that air can always reach it. Starting the pile is the same for both hot and cold piles. You begin with that garden soil or finished compost. Bulky browns, layer all of your greens and browns, each a few inches thick, and then when your pile is 3 to 5 feet tall, top it off with a thick layer of browns and then maybe a tarp. Make sure that the pile is moist all the way through, but not wet. Depending on how dry your browns are, you might need to water them a little bit. Then you turn the pile after about a week, and and then again in another 1 or 2 weeks. And then after that, you can decide how often to turn it until it's finished. And then when you have new materials after you make this pile, save them up and then add them to a different pile. So the cold pile is the very low maintenance way to compost. Whenever you have kitchen scraps or crop residue, you just add them to the pile. And you can dig a hole into the pile and bury them. And just whenever you add greens, always make sure that you add plenty of browns. Since you'll probably have greens more often, you may want to keep a supply of browns near the pile that you can add each time. And then just turn the pile as often as you like. And when you see the bottom of the pile starting to look like compost, like finished compost, start another pile. Because if you keep adding materials forever, the pile will never be finished. You'll know when your compost is finished because it'll basically just look like really dark, rich dirt. It's okay to have a few bigger chunks of leaves or straw in there. You can leave them in or sift them out, but you want to make sure that there's no recognizable food scraps left in there and that the pile doesn't feel hot anymore. And then you can add it to your soil. And remember to stir it into the soil instead of leaving it on the surface to protect the microorganisms and to keep the nitrogen from being released into the air. So how much should you add to your garden? Anywhere from ½ a pound to 2 pounds per square foot per year is a good amount of compost. If you're actively working to improve your soil, you should aim closer to 2 pounds, but if you're just going for maintenance, ½ a pound to a pound should be fine. A 5-gallon bucket of compost will probably weigh about 20 pounds or so, so 4 buckets per 20-foot bed should be about right for 1 pound per foot. And remember, this can be split up over multiple applications like spring and fall, because remember to always add compost every time you start a new crop. And you just sprinkle it in a thin layer over the soil and mix it in. Alright, so let's talk about some common materials used for building a compost pile. Kitchen scraps is a really powerful source of greens. Just collect everything up from when you're cooking, like carrot peels, apple cores, coffee grounds and coffee filters, eggshells, just all of your food waste. And I keep mine in a bowl in my fridge and then just take it out to the pile every day or two. If you're currently throwing all of your food scraps in the garbage, you will be amazed at how much less trash you have after you start composting. So grass clippings, if you have a lawn that you mow regularly, the clippings are a huge source of materials. If you add them straight to your pile while they're fresh, they're a green source. However, they do mat together in clumps, which you do not want. So add them in thin layers or just make sure they're mixed in really well with the rest of the pile. If you want to use grass clippings as a brown source, you just let them sit out and dry for a few days. Crop residue, remember this is all the stuff that you pull out of your garden that you don't want to eat. So cabbage leaves, carrot tops, old dead plants. If they're really large or tough, break them up with a shovel or chop them into your pile with your pruners if you can, because smaller pieces will decompose much faster. And don't compost diseased plants because the germs may not be killed and then they may remain in your garden. Weeds are great, but if you aren't confident that your pile will be hot enough, you may want to avoid weeds with seeds or big perennial roots. Pet bedding, this is from herbivores only, so rabbits, rodents, and birds should be fine, as well as horse and cow manure if you have it, but do not compost any manure from dogs, cats, or reptiles because they may be contaminated. And I still do recommend doing a hot pile if you include any animal manures just in case. And if you use manure mixed with plenty of bedding, it's actually a balanced source of greens and browns. Carbon sources, brown sources, dried grass clippings, like I mentioned, you just leave them out for a few days. Straw is a good, reliable source of carbon, but unless you have access to straw for free, I would only use it if you don't have another brown source available because the cost can add up. Fallen leaves, if you have a lot of leaves in the fall, you can store them as a brown source and they'll last you quite a while. And same goes for pine needles if you have them. Sawdust is a really concentrated source of browns. So if you can get sawdust from untreated wood only, it will really keep any smells or wet food scraps under control and hidden from animals. I especially recommend sawdust for composting animal products because it really seals it up. Any kind of paper, like newspaper, egg cartons, pizza boxes, just tear or cut them up into smaller pieces to help them decompose, and don't use any really glossy or colorful paper. Wood chips, you certainly can use wood chips, but I wouldn't overdo it because wood generally takes longer to break down than the other materials. Okay, so there are some ingredients that have a bit of a controversy in composting. There's nothing really wrong with composting all of these materials. They're organic materials, they're good sources of nutrients, and they decompose like everything else. But however, since animal products in particular are very strong sources of nitrogen and nutrients, animals are also very interested in them. So it's up to you whether you compost animal products or not. I encourage it because they are such concentrated sources of nutrients and energy. Like, think about how much grass a cow had to eat to produce a steak. That shouldn't go to waste. But in order to keep the smell down and avoid attracting any animals to your pile, you just have to balance any animal products with plenty of browns. So to get rid of them, you just dig a hole really deep into your pile, bury your animal products mixed with browns if possible, and then cover it with a thick layer of browns, and something dense like sawdust or wood chips is best to absorb any liquid or any smells and cover it really thoroughly. You shouldn't have any animal issues if you use this method, but if you do, you can also just add physical barriers to your pile as well. If you're composting animal products, you can compost bones as well. Those are included. Depending on the pile and the size of the bone, it may not be fully decomposed by the time the rest of your compost is ready, but it still will have added nutrients to the compost. If for some reason you need to get rid of raw meat, you should bury it elsewhere just in case your pile isn't hot enough to kill any potential germs. Oil and fats is another one that people worry about because it's also very calorie dense and attractive to animals. I wouldn't dump like a full container of fire oil into the pile all at once, but small amounts of oil are perfectly fine, especially if they're combined with dry browns. Salty foods shouldn't be a big deal either, as long as they only make up a small portion of the compost. And bread and citrus, people also worry about, but those are also completely fine. Just keep your greens and your browns balanced. This is by far the biggest reason why people have issues with their pile. I've mentioned compost tea before, and it's a great way to stretch your compost further and use it as a more quick release fertilizer. All you do is soak some compost in a bucket of water for a few days, and then you can either just water your plants with it or you can spray it directly on the leaves to help control fungal issues like powdery mildew. Usually a 5-gallon bucket is a good size for brewing compost tea, but you can scale it to make it as small or as large of a batch as you want. It's a very loose recipe. Basically, you just start by filling the bucket with water. If you use tap water, let it sit for a couple of days to release the chlorine, because chlorinated water can kill off some of the compost microbes. And then you add a small shovelful of finished compost to the water. You can dump it straight in and strain it at the end, or you can put it in like a tea bag of, a pillowcase or an old sock, something like that. And then you just stir it and let it sit for a few days, stirring a couple of times a day to make sure that there's plenty of oxygen in there. And you can brew it from anywhere from 1 to 7 days, depending on how strong you want it to be, with 3 or 4 days usually being about right. When you're done, You can use it as is, or you can dilute it until it looks like a somewhat weak cup of tea if you want it to go farther. Then you just water your crops with it, or you load it into a sprayer and spray it on the plant's leaves. If you spray it, make sure that it has been filtered very well so that the sprayer doesn't get clogged with any compost bits. And spray early in the morning or late in the evening, just like you would do with any other foliar spray. And you can water with compost tea as often as every 2 weeks if you like, or just whenever it looks like your plants could use a boost. All right, I want to run through the specifics on how to harvest each of your crops. I sent you the full chart so you can come back to it when you need it, and I'll just go through some highlights. So when you're looking at the chart, the rows go straight across for each crop, but if the info is the same for multiple, I just wrote it once. So this chart shows how to know when it's ripe, when it's overripe, how to harvest it, how to store it, and then any other notes that I have. So when you harvest and what you do right after harvest makes a big difference in the storage time and quality of your vegetables. If you try to pick lettuce in the heat of the day, it'll wilt and it's not going to bounce back. So first thing in the morning is the best time to harvest because that's when the plants are the most full of moisture, or you can just harvest them right before you plan to eat them. If you can't harvest in the morning and you won't be using the vegetables right away, it's important to remove the field heat from them. This just means that you cool them off right away to help preserve their quality. For most vegetables, washing them is enough to do the trick, and then you can put them in the fridge. It's just something to think about while you're out there. A few vegetables like summer squash don't need to be washed before being put in the fridge, and if they are slightly wet, they can actually go bad faster. Everything should always be very dry before it goes into the fridge, with special attention for leafy greens, which are the most fragile. If you have a salad spinner, you can use that for greens before they go in the fridge, or else just pat them dry with a cloth and then they'll store for much longer. So when you harvest leaf lettuce and spinach, you can pick individual leaves if you only want a few, or you can just slice straight down the line to harvest more. Just make sure to leave a couple of inches of stem at the bottom so that you don't cut the growing tip. And then this way the leaves can regrow and then you can get another harvest. One thing that is very common with cool weather crops is what is called bolting. When these crops are exposed to warm weather, they decide it's time to flower, and they shoot upward very quickly and put out their flowers. Unfortunately, this also causes the leaves of the plant to become very bitter. So it's important to harvest your crops in a timely manner if the weather is warm, but you can also try to put off the bolting process by harvesting heavily so that they have to keep focusing on their leaves. Head lettuce can look very different based on its variety, so make sure that you know what your lettuce is supposed to look like when it's mature. And to harvest head lettuce, you can cut the root off at ground level, or if you won't be using it right away, you can leave the root on and store the whole thing in a bowl of water. Kale and chard are similar to each other. You snap the leaf off where it meets the main stem, but make sure you take off the whole leaf stem because this will encourage the plant to grow more leaves if you take the entire thing. For kale, you snap the stem down, then up, and for chard, you snap left, right. So when you harvest, start from the bottom of the plant. Always go for the lower leaves because those are the oldest, and remove any leaves that are too old to eat if there's any yellow leaves or anything, and then only 2 to 3 more at a time for you to eat because the plant does need to have plenty of leaves to be able to keep growing. You can harvest broccoli whenever it has a head, but it will be at its best and biggest when the florets have softened up a bit and are a little bit loose instead of tightly packed together. This will usually happen from the outside to the inside, so you can wait until the whole head is loose, or if the weather is getting hot and the broccoli is getting ready to turn bitter, then just when the outside is loose, you can harvest it. You can choose how low to harvest it, depending on how much stem you like. If you peel the stem, it's really tasty, but if you're hoping to get a second crop of little smaller florets, make sure that you leave behind plenty of leaves. To test whether a cabbage is ready, just squeeze the head to feel how firm it is, and start doing this before you suspect it's ready so that you can feel the difference. An unripe cabbage will have sections that have a little give to them where there's some empty space, and a ripe cabbage will feel like a really solid ball. To harvest, you can snap the leaves downward to have easier access to the stem, and then just cut it across. Your cold roots are all pretty similar to each other with carrots, radishes, beets, and turnips. You can just run your finger around the root underground to see how big it is, and then just harvest it at your desired size. With the exception of radishes, these can all stay in the ground for several weeks once they're mature. So you can harvest them as you like, but after a few weeks they are prone to splitting and bolting, and the flavor really suffers after that. Radishes need to be harvested pretty quickly because they do progress so fast and they're prone to splitting. Beet and turnip greens, actually all of these greens are edible, but if you store them in the fridge with the tops on, the roots will lose moisture and go soft, so it's best to separate them first and then store them apart. Peas and beans are also all pretty similar. You want to pick them when the pods are full, but not so full that they're starting to turn pale or yellow. And when you harvest, hold on to the branch where it connects to the pod and pinch it off from there, because if you just yank it, you'll either break the branch off or you'll lose the top of the bean. Also, lima beans should not be eaten raw. They actually have a small amount of cyanide in them, so they need to be boiled first. It's nothing to be afraid of. It's a very small amount, but it's not the best choice for snacking when you're out in the garden. Storage crops are the ones that you can preserve for months at a time if you harvest them correctly. Potatoes, you can sneak in to take potatoes while they're still growing if you can't wait. There should be large enough potatoes to reach down and grab after the plant flowers, but they're not ready for full harvest until the foliage has all died back. And if you intend to store them for a long time, wait a couple more weeks before digging so that their skins can thicken up. And then dig them with your fork, but start from about 12 inches away from the plant so that you don't accidentally stab them. And then you can go in with your hands and sift through the dirt. Because even after you think you found them all, there still definitely could be one or two more. Sweet potatoes are fully ripe when their vines have died back too, but sometimes this doesn't happen before the first frost, so make sure you dig up your sweet potatoes if we are expecting cold weather so that they don't get frozen. And they store best in warmer temperatures, and it takes them a few weeks to fully develop their sweetness, so wait to eat them if you can. Onions can be harvested as early as you want if you plan to eat them right away. If you plan to store them, wait until their stems flop over onto the ground, and then store them in a warm, dry place to let them fully dry out. And then after that, you can clip the tops and the roots. Winter squash and pumpkins are another single harvest crop where you'll probably have time for them to ripen before the first frost, but you definitely want to get them indoors before then if you're cutting it close. So for herbs, I give heights on when you can start harvesting, but it's really just an estimate. So all the time when you're harvesting herbs, you just kind of need to use your best judgment. If the plant is small and there aren't that many leaves, wait longer or just pick a tiny bit. And then as it gets bigger, you can harvest more. The bigger the plant, the more you can take off. But just never harvest more than like a third of the plant if you want it to grow back. The flavor of most herbs is affected when they bolt, when they start to flower. So if they're starting to go, you can cut them back heavily to try to slow them down. But for dill and cilantro, you may want to let the flowers grow so that you can harvest the seeds. And chive flowers are also edible, and they pretty much taste just like chives, which is fun. It's best if you use herbs right away after picking them, but if you need to store them in the fridge, they do well in a glass of water, like a bouquet, with the exception of basil, which can go in a glass of water but at room temperature, and chives, which do better wrapped in a paper towel in the fridge. Just make sure that the leaves aren't underwater when it's in the glass so that they don't rot. To harvest dill seeds and coriander, wait until the seeds on the plant are just about dry, but not so dry that they're going to shatter and fall off. And then you cut off the flower head and hang it upside down indoors to finish drying. This could take around 2 weeks. And you can use the same method if you want to dry the herbs themselves too, although I don't really recommend drying chives. For sunflower seeds, they should be ready to harvest when the back of the sunflower head has turned yellow and the petals are falling off. If there are birds or squirrels coming for the seeds before you're ready to harvest them, you can cover the head with a piece of fabric or a mesh bag, a paper bag, something like that, to keep them away. If you're really worried about animals, you can harvest them a little early when the back of the head is just starting to turn yellow instead of fully yellow, and then just hang the head upside down indoors until the seeds are fully dry. And then you just rub it to get all of the seeds to fall out, and if they don't come out easily, you can try drying the head a little bit longer. And it's fine to eat sunflower seeds raw if you want, or you can roast them in the oven first. Okay, now we have our classic summertime vegetables. Sweet corn should feel very full when you squeeze the ear all the way up to the top, not narrow. And if you peel back the husks a little bit and break open a kernel, it should have like a milky white fluid. If it's watery, it's not ripe yet. And if it's thick and doughy, it's overripe. Summer squash and okra are surprisingly similar. Both of them grow very quickly and are very good at hiding from you. So be sure to check them every day and pick them at the size that you like. Smaller sizes are more tender, but obviously at larger sizes you get more out of them. And cut them with a little bit of stem attached, especially for squash. All peppers start out green and then turn whatever other color they turn. So you can harvest them green or you can wait for full color. Full color takes quite a bit longer and the weather has to be very warm, but the peppers are a lot sweeter, so it's worth it. And I recommend cutting them off of the plant because the plants are pretty fragile, and if you try to snap it off, it could take off the whole branch. For cucumbers, the size that you harvest the cucumber at depends on the variety. They all look very different. But for cucumbers, one way to tell is that when they start out, it kind of looks like they have their cheeks sucked in, like it's a little bit hollow on the sides, and then you know that it's ready when the sides are all rounded out. And then finally, these are the summer fruits that do not need to be stored in the fridge. So, okay, tomatoes. Some varieties of tomatoes, like Cherokee Purple, which we're growing this year, can be hard to tell when they're ready to harvest because the shoulders, the top part of the tomato, aren't always all the way red or yellow or whatever the color of the tomato should be. So just look underneath at the bottom of the tomato, and if the bottom has a full dark color, then you can pick it. And when it's at this stage where the bottom is full color but the rest isn't yet, it can sit out on the counter for a few days and it will continue to ripen. But if you want to pick it and use it right away, wait until it's fully colored. And any tomato that's sitting on a counter will turn red over a few days, but if it wasn't ripe on the bottom when you picked it, it will not continue to get sweeter and the flavor won't really be great. So wait until the bottom has full color. And don't store your tomatoes in the fridge. They will not continue to ripen and it will ruin their texture. For watermelon, you've all heard about knocking on the melon, which has varying levels of success, and probably that the light colored spot on the bottom should be a deep yellow instead of white, and that is definitely true. You can also look for the curly tendril closest to the stem. That should dry up when the melon is about ripe. And the sugar baby watermelons in particular should stay on the vine even a little bit after the tendril turns brown for the maximum sweetness. Just don't let the stem get fully brown or it could be too late. When cantaloupes are ripe, they separate from the vine. They are very soft at this stage, so if you like them a little bit firmer, you can harvest them sooner. They should smell sweet once they're ripe if you smell at the blossom end. And if they smell fermented or off, that means they're overripe. If they don't have much of a smell, they're not ripe yet. And they will slowly soften after being picked, but they will not ripen any further. They won't get sweeter. All right, that is it. So if any of those methods sounded confusing, it will become much more clear when you have the plant in front of you. Don't worry. And you have this chart for reference for when you're getting ready to harvest each of these crops. All right, so that's weeding, trellising, composting, and harvesting, which puts you well on your way. Next month, we'll talk about troubleshooting, so common garden problems and what to do about them, pests, diseases, all of those sorts of things. So thanks for watching.